Welcome to the Walter Bosley channel, where once again our friend Sesh Heri, the amazing author, is joining us. And this time, folks, it's very exciting because we're talking about a new book, a new Sesh Heri book. Fantastic work of fiction. It's amazing. Sesh, welcome back.
Oh, thank you, Walter. Great to be back, I will tell you.
Show us Labor in Vain.
Oh, my goodness. I got to show this fantastic cover designed by Walter Bosley himself, Labor in Vain.
Oh, beautiful.
Very mysterious subject matter.
So,
It's a,
how is your copy? You liking it? I mean, does it
I
look
love it.
nice?
It looks nice. Look, you put me on the back when I was young, a
Look
little
at
younger,
that. That's how we
with my
do it.
crystal. Um, it's a beautiful book the way it's been put together, and it is an illustrated novel.
Yes.
Let me see, find a good example of a. Uh, Here's the first major illustration.
Look at that, folks. Sesh illustrates his own books, as you know. Look at that.
That is uh, that is the alchemical laboratory of my ancestors, Benedict Pulsifer and his father standing behind him, Benjamin Pulsifer. And they were immigrants to America in the 1600s. It's a long story, and it's a novel now.
And folks, you'll notice it's hardcover, just like the Wonder of the Worlds trilogy. Wonder of
Yeah,
the Worlds, Metamorphosis, and The Lost Pleiad are all hardcovers.
very
We're doing
nicely
all of
done.
Sesh's books in hardcover now.
Yeah, that's that's exciting, without a
Very
doubt.
much so. So tell us about this novel and start with what motivated you to write this one.
Well, it's a long story, and I think what we ought to do is kind of recapitulate what I have in the foreword of the novel, because I present thoroughly the history of the writing of this novel, which is quite interesting. But let's go back to 1979, almost 45 years ago or something. And at that time, my two brothers were interested in doing genealogical research because we didn't know anything about our ancestors beyond our father. And the reason for that, my father's father, my grandfather, died when my father was only about 2.5 weeks old. And it's a very dramatic story. You want me to recount that? Or the
Yes.
This happened in 1919. And my father and their family, they were living in a little house there in southern Alabama. And my grandfather, his name was Guy, he was out working in the field about a mile away from his house with some other men. They were digging in the field for some reason. I don't know why. And one of them said to Guy, "Hey, look yonder. That looks like your house on fire." He turns around and there's a big plume of smoke coming out of the very place where his house was. He dropped his tools and ran all the way to get to his house. And when he got there, he discovered that his house wasn't on fire. It was his next door neighbors, lived right next to him. He went inside, and my grandmother and the children were in the bedroom. And he asked her, "Is everybody all right?" "Yes." And so he went out the back door, went to the well, got a bucket of water, came back through the house to go to the other house. This was the shortest distance to get that water and go through the house again, come back out. And he was going with that big bucket of water to try to fight that flame as best he could. And right there in the middle of the bedroom, he just said, "Lord, have mercy." And he grabbed at his chest, dropped the bucket of water, and collapsed to the floor dead. And that was the end of Guy Pulsifer, and he was a mystery to us. My father, as I said, was only 2.5 weeks old, and he didn't know his father, and he grew up hearing about him. He had a few little anecdotes, and I heard these when I was probably about 2 or 3 years old. He said that his father was rich originally. He lived in a big mansion, and they lost all the wealth, but he didn't know the full story of it, and that was it. And so we grew up. We didn't know anything about our people on my father's side, and somewhere there about 1979, my brother Jerry, he got interested in heraldry, genealogy. He wanted to look into the family tree, and there was that big mystery looming. Where did we come from? Who were we? I can tell you one thing. When I started school, when I was in kindergarten, the teacher said we all had to learn how to write our names. In those days, now today kids already know how to read, I suppose, when they're in kindergarten, but in those days it was much more like daycare. But she said you have to learn to write your name at the bottom of anything you do in the class. So I went home and I had my mother write out my name on a piece of paper, and I had this little slip of paper and I put it in my jeans. And I get to school, I'd unfold that paper when I needed to write my name, and I just copy it down. I didn't know the alphabet or anything. I could draw. I could always draw pictures as long as I can remember. And so I did it as a drawing. I just copied the name down as a drawing, and there it was. But that's when I became aware of my last name. And the name I was writing down was David Pulsifer. And all the viewers out there, the ones who are regulars on your channel, they know me as Sesh Heri. That is a pen name. My real name is James David Pulsifer. And when I was a kid, I went by David. And so I wrote that name out and I said, what is that name Pulsifer? That sounds weird, because all of my friends, they were named Brown and Jones and Smith, and all these ordinary sounding names. And Pulsifer, what's that? And I thought to myself, that sounds like a gypsy or something. I didn't know what it was. But I didn't dwell upon it. The years went by. That was my name. I just thought it's a strange name. Who cares? But there in 79, my brothers were interested in all this, and I had no interest in it. My feeling was about genealogy was that what difference does it make who your ancestors were? It's what we do today that matters. And so I didn't really have any interest in it. But my brother, Tom, he took over the genealogical research from my brother, Jerry, and he really got into it. And I was quite astonished by that because he was a CPA. He later became an administrative law judge. Where in the world would he get time to do genealogical research? I don't know, but he did it. And he was passionate about it. And I started going on research trips with him all over the United States to go to the places where these ancestors of ours live to do more particular research. In 1992, they had a big Pulsifer reunion, a national Pulsifer reunion. And by then, Tom had connected to this group, and he and I went back there to that. And it was then that I really became interested in the genealogy, because I realized that our lineage was unusual, to say the least. And I had been studying paranormal issues for a number of years already, and I was particularly interested in UFOs. But I began to realize that our lineage was mysterious, and particularly this first Pulsifer that came to America from England in the 1600s and settled in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and where he lived and the people around him. And what little I knew of alchemy at that time, um, he lived directly across from a plot of land that was originally owned by John Winthrop Jr. Uh, Now, some people might recognize that name. His father, John Winthrop, founded Boston in the early 1600s. That family was very powerful. They were very wealthy. And as I began to do some research into the whole thing, I suspected that there was some kind of strange, subtle connection between the Winthrop family and the Pulsifer family. And it's quite involved, but a lot of that went into my novel, Labor in Vain. But what I realized was where Benedict lived was no accident. That was an alchemical neighborhood, and there's a lot of indications why I think that. I don't know if we have time to discuss it today, but um, I would just recommend people getting my novel and reading about it because it is fascinating, and the whole subject of alchemy is fascinating. Um,
We'll jump right in on the novel. And I've read it, of course,
yeah,
and it's really interesting. It's a little different from your other trilogy.
it's somewhat different. It's an earlier time period. My first trilogy was set in the late 19th and early 20th century. Um, so there is some differences. And I had to tackle the language problem too, because in the late 1600s, the English language was undergoing a major transition from the Old English into the Elizabethan era English. And then we got into modern English in the 1700s. Uh, During the War of the Revolution, although English was somewhat different than it is today, largely, if you could go in a time machine back to 1776, you could communicate pretty well with everybody there. They were speaking very much the way we do. But if you go back into the 1600s, you would notice some real differences. And it was those differences that I found very challenging. I had to learn how people spoke that transitional English. It wasn't Old English anymore, but it wasn't modern English either. And it was really fascinating to figure that out. And then on top of that, you have the different characters. Everybody, even today, we all talk differently, even though we're all speaking the same language and we could live in the same town and we could be members of the same family and we still talk differently. So it's pretty complicated. But Labor in Vain is about Benedict Pulsifer. He's the main character. He came to the New England colonies in 1659. He immigrated from England. A long time we thought that Benedict came over here by himself as a young man, but later research revealed to us that he actually came with his wife and his father and his mother. And this is all told in Labor in Vain. And he came over here and he lived in Ipswich, Massachusetts. And the story of Benedict is really his quest in alchemy. People in those days in New England were immersed in alchemy. We don't realize it today. It's not taught in our public schools, in the history classes, but professional historians know about this. And in researching my novel, I came across this fascinating book written by Professor Walter Woodward. He was the state historian for Connecticut. He was also taught at the University of Connecticut. And he wrote a book about John Winthrop Jr. And he explained how alchemy was an actual movement in the colonies. It was called Pan-Sophism. a lot of people were alchemists in those days. Um, and Winthrop was the premier alchemist of the colonies. He was the governor of Connecticut, the colony of Connecticut in Hartford, Connecticut. And he also lived some part of the year in New London, Connecticut, which was down on the coast. And New London was the first industrial town on the North American continent. They manufactured iron, but everybody at New London that was involved in the various manufacturing industries were alchemists. They were all practicing alchemists, and they all were centered around John Winthrop Jr. down there. And there was also the Pequot Indians, the Pequot Nation. They had a major village there next to New London, and they were servants for the English colonists. So it's a very interesting story about how those Indians meshed with the colonists and worked with them there at New London. And that's in my novel. But the story of my novel is all about my ancestor Benedict. It's about his relationship with his second wife, Susanna Waters. Susanna Waters was from a wealthy family. They lived in Salem. And to just give the viewers an idea about this, Boston was the central city of that area of New England. It was the culture center, where everything was done. And then north of that was Salem. That was a shipping center. A lot of things were sent out of Salem over to England. And Salem also received a lot of shipping from the Caribbean. So there was a lot of mercantile activity there. And Susanna's father, he was involved in all of this, but he was mainly an ironmonger. And piecing it together, I could figure out that he was dabbling in alchemy too. And so they were the upper class. But Benedict was just a farmer, ostensibly. He was what they called in those days a husbandman. And those people almost never were able to read. It would have been very odd if an ordinary farmer actually could read books. But in Benedict's case, he was not only literate, he was very well read. And all the historical evidence shows that he had a knowledge of the law. And a lot of what we know about Benedict comes from court records that still exist to this very day. And I say that, a court record is almost like a time machine for a historian. You're right there in the room, and you can almost hear the people talking. And so they did have extensive court records in the 1600s. And I went back there to those areas with my brother, and we went in and we actually found the original documents, on parchment, and looked at these things. They're just sitting up on shelves in some of the places. So Benedict could read. He was educated, and somehow or another, after his first wife died, within a few months, he marries Susanna Waters from this wealthy family. There's quite a story implied there. I did a lot of digging with it, and it constitutes the first part of Labor in Vain, where he marries Susanna Waters. Quite unusual. And what's the story behind all that? Well, it's all about alchemy, and one of the sections of the book at the beginning is called chemical wedding, which was an old term from alchemy. And I would say that Benedict and Susanna's marriage was a chemical wedding. And so the story proceeds with Benedict, his father, Benjamin, and Susanna's father, Richard Waters, forming an association, a partnership to make silver. They specifically were making silver. Um, and so it's quite an adventure they go on. But there's all kinds of characters in the novel, all kinds of fantastic things. There are pirates. There are wild. I know it's not politically correct to say this today. There were wild Indians. That means they were warriors and
Yeah, yeah.
vicious. You know.
Another thing is you can't write about certain things, in that part of the country, in that part of North America, without meeting Mr. Lovecraft and his interests along the way,
Oh yeah.
which I think Lovecraft fans, there's something in this novel for them to enjoy,
Oh
even though your work is not Lovecraftian, so to speak. It's
no.
still that part of the country.
Well, it's that part of the country. It's also, it fringes upon, I'd say Lovecraft and I are kind of, he's over here in his world, I'm over here in my world, but the edges sort of mesh because we're looking at the same stuff.
Yeah.
And the thing about Lovecraft, so he was a New Englander, and he was aware of the history of New England and the esoteric things. Um, he was very much aware of Mystery Hill in New Hampshire. Uh, this is a megalithic site there, and no one really knows when it was built. When the colonists first came in there, they thought the Indians built it, and then the Indians said, "No, we didn't build that. That was here as long as our people have any verbal record of being. It's always here. The old ones built this." And in my novel, uh, a very key element of that is the construction there on the property where Benedict lived of one of those cellars that um, Lovecraft writes about. Mystery Hill is one of those places where in New England there are these strange megalithic constructions, and you can go down, and the whole thing's buried underground, and you can go into tunnels. I've been through the tunnels of Mystery Hill, and it was made by people who knew how to do dry masonry stonework. There's nothing in between the stones. It's just stacked. But they were very good at doing that. And in the novel, Benedict and Benjamin discover this tunnel on their property that takes them down deep into the earth under the Ipswich River. And it's a chamber, an ancient chamber that no telling how many thousands of years old it is. And that's where they set up their alchemical laboratory. Well, that's all very authentic because that whole area, I believe it was an alchemical neighborhood. One indication of that are the names of the streets right in that area. You see, Benedict lived right on the shore of the Ipswich River, which flows through Ipswich. On one side of him is the river. On the other side is the street, East Street, and across the street from that is the property where John Winthrop Jr. lived when he founded Ipswich. And right out there in the middle of the river, where the street that Benedict lives on, where it ends right at the shore of the river, is an area of the river that was known as a rough spot. They would sometimes use the term rough spot or whirlpool. And that means if you were coming down the river there, rowing a boat, and you get to that rough spot, if you're coming down the flow of the river, you might find difficulty proceeding any further because you'll hit a whirlpool that'll spin you around, send you upriver again. And you have to really row hard to get past that area. And for that very reason, when they built the pier, the waterfront for Ipswich, they built it about a block down from where that rough spot was, because that's the end of the navigable river there. So they built the city pier down river of that. And notice that Winthrop, when he founded the town, where did he build his house? He built it right by that rough spot and right by the city pier. He was in the midst of everything. And that street that Benedict lived on, it was called Hovey Lane. It was originally called Short Street, but they changed the name to Hovey Lane. And there's a reason for that. If you went directly across the river on the other side to the southern shore of the river, there's another road there. It takes up and it goes on to the south. It's headed out towards Salem. And that road was called Labor in Vain Road. And it went through an area of farms that were called the Labor in Vain Fields. So that whole area where Benedict lived was called Labor in Vain, after that road and the fields. And why was it named Labor in Vain? Why was it named Hovey Lane? Because of that river rough spot that, you get to it and you'd have to labor in vain to get past it. You had to heave to get past it. And so they named those two streets after that water phenomenon in the river. Yeah. So the whole thing about this river rough spot, I'm calling it, or a whirlpool, what is it about all that? Well, that was a geological anomaly. It was very real. And I had this actually explained to me in 1992 by a distant relative of mine who was the host of the National Pulsifer Reunion. We went by there in a tour bus, and he explained the whole thing to me and everybody else, that there was a whirlpool or a rough area in the flow of the water there. And that's why they named those two roads, Hovey Lane and Labor in Vain. And that was all there was to it. But I had already been studying geomorphology for some years. And it immediately occurred to me that that was very, very significant, that Benedict's house was right next to that spot. And also John Winthrop Jr. That spot had alchemical properties to it. It was on what I would call a ley line. It was on a stress in the landscape, and it had formed, it was a cross of land stress like this. This arm actually formed the course of the Ipswich River. This was the roads, Labor in Vain and Hovey Lane, coming across it. So right in the middle of that cross, you had an intersection of mechanical stress, and it was creating a rise in the land. So what was happening? Why was there a whirlpool there? Nobody ever tried to figure that out. It was a rise in the floor of the riverbed, which caused the water to circulate. Simple as that. So you say, well, it's just a mechanical phenomenon. So what? Well, the so what is that was a ley line of stress. And I'd spent some years studying ley lines and their properties. And I already knew that an intersection of ley lines like that is highly significant, and it has all kinds of odd properties to it. And alchemists were very, very interested in those properties. That's why that was an alchemical neighborhood. And also, the very term labor in vain had a special meaning in alchemy. It also has a meaning in theology. The term comes from the Old Testament, the book of Psalms. Psalms chapter 127, verse 1 talks about laboring in vain. And that's where encoded in that one verse is the real secret of alchemy. There's something about that you can do anything and everything, but if you don't have that secret ingredient, you will not have success. And it tells you what it is. I won't say it here, but I encourage the viewers to look up that verse and read it and think about it, because that's the theme of the novel, Labor in Vain. What's the secret ingredient of alchemy? And in the plot line of this novel, it reveals it through the life of Benedict Pulsifer. he learns through the course of living the secret of alchemy. Um, so that's the story of Labor in Vain. And it's, in my opinion, this is the most authentic fictional account of alchemy ever written. There's been a lot of books out about alchemists, the alchemist, and whatever. They're not very accurate. Alchemy is actually an ancient science that goes back to Atlantis,
Mhm.
and it's been practiced for thousands of years. And yes, it's still practiced today. There are real alchemists. I don't claim to be an alchemist, but I have studied it from the outside. And also, I found that I'm of a esoteric lineage. And
I was going to say, this is,
yes,
in addition to being, a great novel about alchemy and an alchemist, this is a personal story for you. These are family members.
absolutely. A very strange thing happened to me in writing this novel. We all have family members. You got Uncle Joe and Uncle Bill and Aunt Mary and whatever. We all have our family, and we know them. They have real personalities. We know the family dynamics. We could sometimes see ourselves in relatives. We say, I'm like that guy,
For better or worse.
for better or worse. We could see both our faults and our strong points, but I extrapolated from the historical record, and my brother Tom had done such meticulous historical research into our lineage. He had all the documents and everything, and I could piece that together, and I began to see, it's like putting a jigsaw puzzle together or whatever, and it begins to emerge. Or I think of a Polaroid, the old Polaroid camera. You take a picture, and then it starts developing and you say, oh, I got this little piece here. It's coming out. That's a face. And, it's just bits and pieces. But when it fully comes out, it's the full story. You see the personality of the people and what they're doing. And that's what happened for me in writing this. And I said, I know these people. Yeah, I could see characteristics of them in some of my relatives of the present, and myself. I realized I'm writing about my family. And I'm becoming reacquainted with people I never met. They're real people to me, very much so. And I think the people that read this novel, they're going to become immersed in it. They're going to see, wow, these people really existed. I mean, one thing about history that always turned me off when I was a kid studying it in school was it was abstract. You know how they taught history. It was the date of wars and who was president and who, and what happened here and there, little points in time. You couldn't relate to it. You couldn't say, well, what was the reality of, if I got in a time machine and went back there, what would I experience? We didn't have that. So in writing the novel, that period of the late 1600s, it did come alive to me. That might be a cliche, but it came alive to me as real people, and I understood them, and I understood that time better. And so this novel, it spans from 1673 all the way to 1710, quite a time period. And in that encompasses the Salem witch hysteria of 1692 into 93. And my ancestor Benedict was enmeshed in that period of time and those people, and he knew the people. John Proctor figures prominently in Arthur Miller's Crucible. It was made into a movie some time back, so many of the viewers, I'm sure, are familiar with the Crucible. And John Proctor was the main character in that. And Benedict knew John Proctor very well. In fact, John Proctor lived in Ipswich for decades before he moved to Salem. And he was a neighbor of Benedict's brother-in-law. They all knew each other, and Salem was only 8 miles from Ipswich. Today, that's nothing. But even back then, you could get in a wagon and go 8 miles. It'd take you a little while. And people went between Salem and Ipswich and, these various little towns, Topsfield and, Cape Ann. They weren't very far removed. And that's where all the witch hysteria swept through. It wasn't just in Salem, it was in all of these New England towns. So that's part of the story. And it borders upon the whole issue about alchemy, because a lot of these people were alchemists, and they were they were vulnerable to charges of witchcraft. So that's the story of Labor in Vain, Walter.
Is this, did you grow up hearing about these relatives and the greater history of the family, or did you and your brothers really have to dig it out?
We had to dig it out. We knew nothing about it. My grandfather's name, he was Guy Pulsifer. His real name was
Mhm.
George. Um, all we knew was my father said, well, he was rich and then he lost the money and they lived in a mansion. It was like a fairy tale. So that's all we knew. So from 79 onward, they went back and dug it all up. They had to find out, well, who was Guy's father? And they went back a generation and they discovered, and they just went on, and it was my brother Tom that did most of this research. But we didn't know anything about any of them. But what they found out, I have to say, I didn't find out anything. I just lucked out that I had my brother Tom was just such a genius, and he did all of this research. And then in the 90s, he and I started talking about, well, we could write a novel about this, or, a novel should be written about this or that. And I thought, yeah, that's beyond me. I don't think I could do it. I had written a little bit at that point, but
Mhm.
I didn't know anything about these people. And then somewhere along the way, when I started writing novels, I thought, well, there's one story I could write. I told Tom, I said, so there was an ancestor in the Revolutionary War, and his name was David Pulsifer, just like me.
Mhm.
And he was in the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he was 67 years old when he fought in that battle, which is younger than I am now. And his son John was in the battle. And it's a whole story there about how John was going to go off to war. This was 1775, 1775 when all this was going on. And David did not want him to go to war. And he said, I'm going with you, because David was a veteran of the French Indian War. He did no fighting. He got injured in that war. But he was a tavern keeper at that point, and he said to his son, well, I'm going with you. And I think they had a little bit of an argument. But
Well,
the two things,
remember, the whole revolution was fomented in those taverns, so that's where
absolutely.
the revolutionaries were.
What we discovered, well, this was back in 2016. I said to
Mhm.
Tom, I want to write about David Pulsifer in the Battle of Bunker Hill. I said, I can do that. I could see that, that clearly is a story there to be done. And I said, I want you to go back to New England and research it for me. And I wasn't traveling much then. And he went back with his wife, and they went through all these little areas in New England. And where David Pulsifer lived was in a little town in Vermont named Rockingham.
Mhm.
He owned the tavern there. Back in those days, there was no Vermont, of course. That's a state of the United States. In those days, it was called the New Hampshire Grants. And so he had a tavern there. And just like you're saying, the tavern wasn't just a place to
Right.
tip back a few brewskis. It was a social meeting place. It
Mhm.
served all kind of functions. And so there was already conflicts with the Tories and the settlers in that area over land issues. And it was actually the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. And I didn't even know it until my brother went back there and researched the thing. And we found out that that's where the American Revolutionary War really began. There was actually a battle between the Tories and the settlers in that area, the Patriots, you could call them, and it was called the Westminster Massacre. Westminster Massacre. You remember the Boston Massacre? Well, this
Mhm.
This was the Westminster Massacre, they called it. And it was actually a battle waged inside the meeting hall of where they, they had the government for that area at that
Yeah.
time. And it was a very bloody battle. They fought out with swords and pistols, and
Inside the
inside and outside.
so
It was
the
a
American
melee.
Revolution started as a tavern brawl.
Absolutely. That's exactly how it
You
started.
gotta
Oh,
love it. What a
well, it
history.
wasn't a tavern. They did have sort of a
Right.
tavern on the ground floor of the building.
Yeah.
Yes, and they had food in there and everything. Once again, it was different times, but this was a
It's the British tradition of the pub. The pub,
yes,
you know.
yes. But of course, now this was in Westminster. This was some miles removed from Benedict's Tavern in
Hmm.
Rockingham. So they planned this whole thing in the Rockingham Tavern. This is true history, I'm telling you, and I'm
Yeah.
not making I'm not making this stuff up. David Pulsifer and these other men uh, planned this thing, and it was orchestrated. But then it was taken to Westminster, where the real conflict was going on, and they basically threw the Tories out of that uh, governmental building
Hmm.
and and took possession of it, but at a great cost. And David and his son John were involved in that, and that's was the very beginning of this conflict. Then it spread through all these other towns. There were similar incidents in other towns all through New England there in that area of New Hampshire and around Boston and everything that finally flared up into what became this conflict with
Right.
the British troops in Boston,
Okay.
that led to the Battle of Bunker Hill. Yeah.
If you, if let's say a aspiring writer or experienced writer, whatever in between on the spectrum, if you had to give them advice on novelizing, fictionalizing,
Yeah.
um, family history,
Yeah.
ancestry, like you did, what would be your advice to them on doing that?
Well, first of all, you have to do your research very carefully, I would say. You also have to have a sense of a thematic idea. Um, People are not interested in other people's genealogy. And I told this to my brother Tom. I said, look, we've got to make this into a dramatic story. I've got to find a story. I've written one autobiography of Larry Spellman. He had an interesting life. What happened when show business married the mafia? It's basically his story. I just listened to him and I helped him put it together. But
Yeah.
I told him, I said, we've got to find your story. And we found it, and it's a pretty good read. It holds together as a story, beginning, middle, and end. So you've got to find your story. What's this about? What does it mean? You know,
And
um,
I think once you did that with Larry, it it brought it helped him understand what you were doing with his story. And I think
yeah.
then the floodgates opened in a way that, he got it. He got what you were
Oh yeah.
doing. So what he was able to tell you about his very fascinating life,
Oh yeah.
um, just
We
fit.
had a fantastic working relationship on that book, and I think it came from we both knew what we were doing. I
Mhm.
I knew what he needed to do. He was really the author, and
Mhm.
I was the sounding board and the editor. And I was consciously aware of that, and we stuck to that, and it worked. But if you're writing your own story, you have to have this idea that look, you've got to have a story with a beginning, a middle, and end. You've got to have a main character, and you've got to have a secondary character.
Mhm.
And why do plot lines exist in fiction? They exist because they're simply an organic expression of the way human life really is.
Yes.
We all live stories,
Hmm.
and each of us are the main character in our story. And you look back on your life, you say, well, who was the secondary character? And you might have several stories in your life, and you might say, well, there were several secondary characters in my life, and if I tell this story, it's me and so and how that worked out. And then this other story is me and so. Now, if you're talking about your ancestors, and you find an ancestor, you have to find out what's his story, what's her story, who's the secondary character, who's very important to that person, and how did they affect that person's life. And that's your story. And then how that story transpires, you can find your theme in that story.
Right.
So, and the exact chronological process, which do you start first? There's no formula for that. You'd find it organically. And I've said this on your show before. We were talking about writing, and I have the window technique, where
Hmm.
if you're starting out to write something and you want to avoid writer's block, you find the thing you know about the best you can relate to and write that down. And sometimes someone thinking about a story, they'll say, well, I know this one scene, I could imagine it, and I can even imagine what they said. Well, write that down. You've already started on your novel. That's the beginning. It doesn't have to be the first sentence nor the last sentence. It could be somewhere in the middle.
Right.
And I did that with Labor in Vain. There's a particular scene that I wrote first in this novel, and it was my little piece. I think of it as like almost a little coded capsule of the whole novel is in that little scene. And I wrote that, and I said, hey, I know who that person is. That person is. I understand the situation, and then I could back off from that and say, well, how did they get there, and well, what happened? You know, that's the way to do it. So find your ancestor and find the story of your ancestor, the secondary character, and then you'll naturally find the natural arc of that relationship. You're well on your way, and do your research. And you might find that you're halfway through writing your story, and you hit something. You say, I don't know what's the answer to this thing. It might be something they used in those days that now we don't know anything about, and you have to go back and research that, find it out, and you take it as you go. But it can be done. I encourage people to do that.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing what you'll find, and I wanna jump to something else with a quick little bridge to it.
Yeah,
Is that you kind of find interesting little coincidences, or some would say synchronicities. You and I had known each other, I think, a year or so
yeah.
when we discovered we both have a connection to a little town in Alabama called
Oh yeah,
Prattville. And that was
well,
mind
Alan,
blowing because
it is mind blowing, Walter.
my viewers are used to hearing me talk about the haunted house that my uncle and aunt owned, and
Absolutely.
the original
Golson,
location, because it
Golson
had,
Mansion, right?
yeah, the Pope Golson Mansion. It had been
Pope.
moved, but its original position, we think, was right next door to family property of Sesh's family. Now,
Yeah, it is.
this
It,
mention
it is
of
for a fact, Walter. The Golson house was right next door to
right
my
next door, and this was like decades before you and I were even a thought in anyone's
yeah.
mind.
It
So
goes,
when you
yeah.
get into synchronicity and things like this, excuse me, you've written a lot of fiction, and we've got more coming out. I mean, we got more coming out than we've
Oh,
published. And
exciting.
but other than that, you have accomplished a seminal work that is the heartbeat, the through line of everything you write. And that's a little book called The Handprint of Atlas.
Oh yeah, the
And I
handprint.
know that that factors into Labor in Vain.
Oh, it does. It does. And well, I recommend anybody who has not read the Handprint of Atlas get a copy of it and read it, because everybody's always saying, I hear it on your channel among various guests who are saying ley lines, they roll their eyes and they say, oh, nothing to that, superstition. And of course, mainstream scientists write it off and all. But I spent many, many years studying ley lines, and Handprint of Atlas explains my journey in trying to understand it. Ley lines are very real, and they're a part of the physical earth we live on. And the alchemist understood this. Sir Francis Bacon discussed continental drift way back in the day, and he wrote about it. And ever since then, people have been theorizing about continental drift. continental drift and ley lines are intimately connected. And if you read the handprint of Atlas, you'll see how and why they are. But it's all about geophysics and about principles of stress, particularly land stress. So there's a mechanical aspect to this, of course, but there's much more to it than mere mechanics. The physical world we live in is full of life energy. And these places on ley lines where they intersect, they're full of energy and consciousness and intelligence that can be tapped into. And the ancient alchemists knew all about this. They knew where these places were, and they also knew how to get particular types of what today we would call metamaterials. Particularly one type of material they referred to as first matter. It was the first material they would use in their alchemical work. Think of it today as raw material. You've heard that. What's the raw material I'm going to make this out of? It's the same idea. The beginning material you're going to work with, first matter. But the first matter had a lot of metaphorical connotations to it. It related to ideas of cosmology about the beginning of the universe. What was the first matter that emerged at the beginning of the universe? And that matter related to the first matter used in the alchemical process. And so the alchemist, of course, would want to know where to get these metamaterials. And how did they do it? Well, they had a knowledge of ley lines and land shapes, and they could tell the exact places where to go to mine this stuff out. And in Labor in Vain, they actually do this a little bit. That whirlpool area behind their house there is a source of first matter, and they mine that stuff out by hand and use it. They process it and they use it for this alchemical working that they demonstrate to Richard Waters to show them that they really can transmute lead to silver. And so all of that is related. The knowledge of the ley lines and the way the earth, the geophysics of the earth, it's all been known for thousands of years. But I have to say, our rulers, our kings, have kept this knowledge secret because it's powerful knowledge. And the root of it is their power over us. And now today, more knowledge is coming out all the time. But the problem is, as the knowledge comes out, the consciousness of humanity is going down. We're falling into a deep sleep. And that deep sleep, you can describe it as with one word: materialism. We're falling into the deep sleep that all exists is matter, the material universe. And yet, our high energy physicists have discovered that the fundamental substratum of our universe is almost incomprehensible because it exhibits properties of consciousness. And this was one of the things that T. Townsend Brown was studying. He discovered it on his own, but he tapped into the military-industrial complex, and they went down the rabbit hole with that and discovered all kind of weird things that the average person just wouldn't believe it. But out of that came things like the Philadelphia experiment and interdimensional travel and even time travel, which a lot of people just cannot buy that. But they developed all kinds of secret technologies. They're still using them today.
Very true. And boy, at some point you should write something about Brown because your take on
Oh,
you
well, I did.
mentioned going
Okay,
down the
I've
rabbit
got a
hole.
little pamphlet kind of book I've written. It's called Time, Space, and Circumstance.
Yes.
And I do discuss Brown in that. He's very important because what people don't realize is he studied ley lines all of
Right.
his life. It was an integral part of his whole science that he was developing. And a lot of his experimental stations where
Hmm.
he did experiments on gravity occurred at major ley lines. And I can tell you two of them in Florida, Umatilla and Homestead, which was very close to Coral Castle. There
Hmm.
was no accident that Brown had an experimental station there. He lived there for a while in Homestead. And you say, why was he in Homestead? Well, there's a major ley line that goes right through there. And
Hmm.
he had been studying that thing for years because one of the first things he did, real research into gravity, was with an expedition he went on in the early 1930s into the Caribbean with a submarine crew. And he and Harry Hess looked at all the gravity anomalies in the Caribbean.
This is
And
the folks. This is the hot zone, which our friend DJ Dark Journalist
oh
has
yes,
talked about for years now.
yes, Dark Journalist has all kinds of podcasts. I highly recommend the viewers to, if you haven't, if you're not aware of Dark Journalist, I think most of you are, but take a look at his podcast on the hot zone. They've known about those sunken structures for many years, decades, and that's what Brown and his submarine crew, they were looking at it then. This was, I think, 1932.
Hmm.
He and Harry Hess, and now Harry Hess, he's a legend in geophysics because he wrote the seminal essay, History of Ocean Basins, published in 1960.
Hmm.
And that's what got all the mainstream scientists to realize that continental drift was real.
Yeah.
He's the one who really laid it out and explained it for everybody. And he had done the experimental work in submarines. He's the one who discovered the major rift, the Atlantic Ridge, and how it was spreading apart over 200 million years,
Hmm.
creating the Pacific Ocean. He laid out the whole mechanism of that process. And well, who was he associated with? T. Townsend Brown. They knew each other well. And I actually think that they were doing experiments with electrogravity in that submarine expedition of 32. I think they were, this is just my supposition, but I noticed Daniel List, Dark Journalist, he said the same thing recently, that he thought, see, there was an earthquake there in Santiago
Hmm.
while they were down there. They were getting their submarine refitted, and he was saying that he thought that had something to do with what they were doing in the Caribbean with the submarine. Absolutely, I think so. I think they were dropping powerful depth charges at key points. Remember what I said about ley lines, intersectional ley lines?
Yep.
They were mapping the floor of the Caribbean right in that area, and they knew where those stress lines were at, and they were dropping these depth charges to get a physical reaction, not just to create an earthquake, but to gauge the electromagnetic field of the Earth when they would
Right.
do that. And they
Right.
were getting that information, but I think inadvertently, I don't think they wanted to create an earthquake, but I think inadvertently in doing that, it did cause an earthquake. You can cause earthquakes artificially. And that, I just have to mention this. I've written a whole novel about an earthquake being created artificially.
Yes,
It's
indeed.
entitled Vento and the Voice of Ray. And it's about the 1906 San Francisco earthquake,
Yeah.
which I suspect to a certain strong degree that it just might have been created artificially.
Yeah. Fascinating theory. You told me about this years ago. Folks, Vento and the Voice of Ray will be coming out soon. It's going to be Sesh's next fiction release from Lost Continent Library. And I don't know if you recall, but we're talking about this Townsend Brown submarine mission in 1932, and he was involved with looking for Atlantis. But the very first book that I published under my label was a classic reprint, and it dates back to 1927, and it's titled The Sunken World.
Oh, yeah.
And it's by Stanton Koblenz, and it's about an experimental submarine. Now, get this, he wrote it in 1927 about an
Hmm.
experimental submarine that finds Atlantis still
Hmm.
existing under a dome,
Yeah.
under the sea. And folks, the
Amazing.
only place you can get the edition I published is if you contact me. They're printed already, and you can obtain purchase one of those
Oh,
from me directly. A beautiful cover by an artist named Bob All. But
oh,
Sesh,
yeah.
we're
Wow.
down to just a few minutes, and I want to remind everybody where they can find your books. Only at lulu.com,
Right.
lulu.com. And is there anything you wanted to add about Labor in Vain that we didn't say real quick?
I'll just say it's an exciting adventure. You can read it on a lot of
Indeed.
levels. If you're not interested in alchemy, that doesn't leave you out. This is a fascinating story of early Americana. Great characters. They all lived. I believe I captured them authentically, accurately, and you will see, that it rings true. And most of what happened in this novel is history. It really did happen. Some of it is speculation based upon the history. Some of it is, well, people would say it's wild speculation. It's all based upon my research into alchemy, and it is a fantastic novel. And things that you'd think they couldn't do this in the 1600s, I'll have to say, even if they didn't do it in the 1600s, they could have. They could have done this. There's a particular thing, I don't want to give it away, but it's an event in the novel, a pivotal event involving what we would say would be kind of high technology.
Hmm.
They're doing that in the 1600s? Yes, they could have done it in the 1600s. And it's in the novel. And I encourage you to get a copy. It's well worth the price.
Indeed.
It's entertaining, but for those of you into alternative research, it's chock full of encoded information on several levels.
Absolutely. And that's like all your fiction. I tell people all the time, your fiction isn't just, fiction and it's a fun story and that's it.
Yeah,
Your fiction is directly based on your family's history, but it's based on your nonfiction research
yeah,
in particular. So if you've read The Handprint of Atlas and you want to learn more about the concepts in it, by all means read Sesh's fiction because the Wonder of the Worlds trilogy is chock full of that,
yeah,
and also Martians and
yeah.
Underground World and Harry Houdini and all this
Yes.
amazing stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And those books too are available at lulu.com. The Wonder of the Worlds trilogy, that's Wonder of the Worlds, Metamorphosis, and the Lost Pleiad, and now Labor in Vain, and soon Vento and the Voice Array. I mean, Sesh, we're getting ready to just
Yeah.
foist the
Yeah.
world of Sesh Heri onto the world here,
We're
even in
going
a
to
bigger
voice.
way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
It's exciting for me, but I think the viewers will want to get these books. They hang together. There is a
yes, they
thread
do.
for them all. There's a meta story going on, even though
Absolutely.
it's separated by centuries,
Yeah.
literally, what I'm writing about.
Yeah.
And I've got
Well,
a,
we're getting ready. The clock's getting ready to run out here. So
okay,
thank you again, Sesh. We're going to have you on again real soon to
okay.
discuss Vento and other things. So thank you again so much.
Thank you, Walter. Good day.